So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session, Implementing Carbon Pricing in the Power Sector, jointly organized by the International Energy Agency, the World Bank, and the International Carbon Action Partnership. My name is Luca Lore. I'm an international climate policy analyst at the IEA. And just before we start, a few housekeeping instructions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll get to them during our Q&A session later on today. And then just please note that this session will be recorded. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker today, Mr. Tom House, Head of the Energy and Environment Division at the IEA. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Luca, and good day to everybody here who's joining us today. Thank you very much for joining. I'm very happy to have you here, and welcome to this panel on implementing carbon pricing in the power sector. We come here today at a really strange time in the energy world. It's really, we're facing the first global energy crisis. On the one hand, we've got ambitious energy transition plans already in place to address climate change, but these are currently being dominated by global markets and the turmoil triggered by Russia's war. And this combination of multiple short, medium, and long-term market turmoil risks and creates perils and risks that spread across the whole of the economy. We're starting to worry more about energy access, more about inflation, food price increases, supply chain disorders, industrial disruption. So there's an awful lot that's going on, and confronting these multiple challenges is a major topic for all of us around the world today. But we hope, and that's what we'll come to here, we hope it can also be a chance for us to take an historic turn towards a cleaner and more secure energy system. That's because the momentum behind the change in the energy sector is no longer just coming from the price spikes and climate commitments. We now also have a very serious reassessment of energy sector vulnerabilities, which are also a driving force to change. Behind that change, in the face of that change, we've got global energy markets and reviewing their reliance on Russia, because Russia is currently the largest exporter of oil in the world, the largest exporter of natural gas, and a major player in the global coal markets. So when Russia creates turmoil in the geopolitical economy, it's playing havoc with the world's markets as well. So more coherently than ever before, the different forces that drive energy policy of security and climate change and affordability are aligned, and this may be a chance to speed up the energy transition. To do that, the first thing to remember is that we have tools readily available to us, whether that's highly competitive energy efficiency measures or clean energy technologies. And we have a range of different elements there which can be implemented in the short term. And to develop and to deploy all of these things, we have a framing in place, which is the Paris Agreement. This promotes ever-increasing international ambition. And as the IEA has shown, the ambitious pledges up until 2021 would be limiting temperature rises to 1.8 degrees. So we have a framework of the umbrella of the Paris Agreement. We have the technologies, we have the policies, but really what we need to come to is the policy measures and the implementation. That's what becomes critical in the short term. So we need to take this forward. And today's discussion on carbon pricing regimes is delving into one of the tools in the array of different policies open to us that can help drive forward through market measures, driving forward the transition. Now, I talk of market forces, but we know that there are different markets and different states of liberalization around the different economies of the world. But despite these differences, more and more countries are adopting carbon pricing as a tool to decarbonize their power sector in particular. However, these impacts of carbon pricing, the interaction with other policies, the distribution effects, all need analysis and assessment to ensure that we avoid unwanted consequences. So in this panel today, we've got experts who have real-world experience who are going to be outlining what's happened in their particular case studies, in their particular worlds, and what that means for the development and design of carbon pricing regimes as we go forward. The IEA has always seen carbon pricing as an effective policy tool that governments, companies, and others can use to decarbonize their economies. So, and over the decades, we've been working with a range of different countries, with China, with Thailand, with South Africa, and now with Brazil, to understand and how to best design the different aspects of carbon pricing, the benchmarks, the structures, the scope. And we're happy to carry on that work and learn from people today. So to conclude, we're delighted to be here. We're very grateful for the partners for this workshop. And I look forward very much to the discussion. Back to you, please, Luca.
Thanks very much, Tom. Now let's turn to Wendy Hughes, the practice managers at the World Bank Carbon Markets and Innovation Unit. Wendy, over to you.
Hi, Luca, thanks. So hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for attending today's workshop. And thanks very much to Tom and Luca and IEA for inviting me to make some opening remarks. So I'll just kind of pick up and complement what Tom was saying. Clearly, decarbonizing the power sector is a challenge that governments around the world are facing. And carbon pricing has the potential to play a very important role in these decarbonization strategies. In fact, almost all the emissions trading systems and carbon taxes that are in operation today cover the power sector. And more recently, we're seeing a number of developing and emerging economies that are showing interest in carbon pricing. With, for example, China and Mexico have launched national carbon markets in the last few years. And South Africa and many countries in Latin America are already operating carbon taxes. And we see carbon pricing is also being considered in jurisdictions like Indonesia, Turkey, and Botswana. However, it is, I think, really worth noting, and maybe what we can dive into a little bit in today's session, it's worth noting that much of the experience to date with carbon pricing in the power sector has been in the context of higher income countries and implemented largely in liberalized power market settings, often with full 100% access to electricity and stable or low growth in demand for electricity. In emerging and developing countries, the context is often very different, with high growth and demand and power sectors that are often at an early stage of liberalization. And in many cases, the ability to substantially scale up low carbon options like variable renewable energy, wind and solar, for example, will be dependent on mobilizing investment to strengthen existing electricity networks, which are often fairly weak, and also to add some flexibility to the system. So policymakers can and should draw on the lessons from the experience of other countries that have successfully been implementing these instruments. But application of the lessons will need to be customized, informed really by an understanding of the context and considering constraints on the ability of consumers and investors to receive and also to respond to carbon pricing signals. So some of the questions that I think will be discussed today are things like, how does carbon pricing work if you have a state-owned enterprise or a monopoly? And what happens to a price signal to end users if there are energy subsidies in place or if electricity tariffs are not cost reflective? And if investment decisions are determined by a central planning authority rather than the market, what's the role of carbon pricing signal in that particular instance? And really, I think one point which is absolutely critical is that carbon pricing has distributional impacts. Different parts of the economy and different groups of consumers will be impacted differently, both because of how much they spend on electricity, but also access to alternatives. So I think the design of successful carbon pricing intervention needs to include understanding the different impacts across stakeholder groups. And it also should build in an approach to support those who will be negatively impacted. And understanding and addressing these distributional impacts is a core part of the World Bank's carbon pricing work to help governments develop and implement transitions in a just and sustainable manner. So these are just some of the issues that will be explored in a new piece of analytic work, focusing on carbon pricing in the power sector that the World Bank Energy and Macroeconomics and Partnership for Market Implementation teams are working on together with International Energy Agency and International Carbon Action Partnership. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion this morning, and thanks very much to our panel and moderator for taking part in this session, and look forward to a very interesting discussion. Back to you, Luca. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wendy. Now we're going to hear a presentation from Hari Gadde, who is a senior climate change specialist in the carbon markets and innovation practice of the climate change group at the World Bank. So please, Hari, over to you.
Thank you, Luca. Good morning, good afternoon all. Let me share the screen. Hope you can see the slides. Just to start with, of course, I think we all know, CO2 emissions are actually rising, and then the recently published I4C Working Group 3 report makes it very clear that from the existing fossil fuel infrastructure, of course, mostly the power sector, if you maintain the historical operating practices, the estimated cumulative emissions from these actually account to 660 gigatons of CO2 over their lifetime. And then if you also add the planned infrastructure, so that it would be around 850 gigatons. That means this is much higher than the remaining CO2 budget that we have to limit 1.5 degrees. So that means also that it highlights how critical it is for us to decarbonize the power sector. Here, of course, the slide shows that while carbon pricing remains a key component of policy packages, other policies are needed to incentivize emission reductions where carbon pricing is not sufficiently effective. At the same time, these policies, of course, can also make carbon pricing more effective and equitable. So here in this figure, of course, you can see that different rationales for complementary policies in the form of a MAC curve, and there represents the abatement potential of carbon pricing derived from shifting low carbon modes of production or consumption. The green area is where higher carbon pricing is indeed effective and reduces the emissions in cost-effective and permanent way. In many jurisdictions that we know, like EU and others, basically where emissions in the electricity sector are covered in this price range. Carbon pricing importantly affects operational decisions, especially for example, the merit order incentivizing a fuel switch from high carbon intensive coal to less carbon intensive, for example, natural gas. So this basically, of course, also highlights that how governments can use a variety of policy instruments to reduce emissions. One of the recently concluded studies, authors compared the performance of several policy instruments belonging to two different categories, like emissions pricing instruments and standards and regulations, by comparing on different metrics. The overarching message of this exercise is that no single policy instrument is superior to the others along all the above-mentioned criteria. This means also it calls for a comprehensive policy mix that includes complementary measures to enhance the cost effectiveness and social acceptability of decarbonization strategies. This slide shows that, of course, carbon pricing indeed actually plays a critical role in terms of reducing the emissions. As I said, it's like in many of the jurisdictions, or in almost all the jurisdictions wherein carbon pricing is introduced right now, the power sector is part of that thing. And here is one example, for example, in the case of Britain, how the power sector, with the help support of the carbon pricing, along with, of course, other policies, reduce the emissions over a period of time. Of course, but we all know that so far the experience has been, as Wendy mentioned, the carbon pricing in the power sector has been implemented in mostly the liberalized power market settings, where, of course, it plays a critical role in terms of the four aspects. It changes the dispatch of the existing capital stock. It changes the investment decisions. Of course, obviously, it encourages the early retirement, and obviously it also increases the price of electricity. However, the question for us is basically as many developing countries are now in the process of introducing the carbon pricing instruments, of course, with several examples already exist, like Chile and South Africa, which we'll hear in a minute. But of course, they are not fully liberalized, and of course may simply have a state-owned monopoly. Of course, here given these diverse conditions, the question is how carbon pricing is going to function under these different power market structures, and are there any design adjustments are needed? And of course, also, as Wendy mentioned, of course, for many of the developing countries, there are other development imperatives that needs to be looked into, and most critically, the distribution impacts, and then how cost pass-through implications will have or will play a very most important role when it comes to the introducing carbon pricing. So that, I suppose, as Wendy said, the World Bank, ICAP, and then IEA jointly developing a report, especially for to provide some kind of a guidance to the developing countries that are in the process of introducing the carbon pricing, looking to what is the role of carbon pricing in decarbonization planning, what are the prerequisites that might be needed actually for these countries to introduce, and then what's the impact of carbon pricing and interaction with other policies like feed-in tariffs and then renewable energy standards, etc. And also how carbon pricing basically influences or the response to the whole power supply chain, and most importantly, understanding the distribution implications and possible solutions. And in the process, of course, we will also look into the different modeling and the planning tools that are needed to help governments basically to introduce these carbon pricing instruments. So with this short introduction presentation, so let me now introduce Philippe Benoit, who is basically an adjunct senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Philippe is, of course, he's a distinguished career in energy development and climate policy. He has over 25 years of experience in working on, of course, on these areas. Prior to this one, of course, from 2011 to 2016, Philippe also served as the head of energy, environment, energy efficiency at the IEA. In addition to that, of course, Philippe also has been with the World Bank over 15 years. With that brief introduction, so I'll hand over to Philippe for moderating the session. Over to you, Philippe.
Great. Thank you, Harry. And it's a real pleasure to be here. As you noted, in particular, given this joint effort by the IEA and the World Bank. I think when we think about the words from Tom and Wendy and from yourself, Harry, I get a good sense of some of the challenges that we face. In particular, when we look at this issue in the context of emerging economies. And I want to stress the context of emerging economies, because we know when we look at all the IEA projections, basically energy growth in advanced economies will be dropping, while energy growth in emerging economies will be increasing. And if we don't do anything to focus in on emissions in those economies in particular, and the largest emitting sector is the power sector, then we're not going to achieve our climate goals. Carbon pricing in its various forms, taxes, ETS systems, or even just shadow pricing, has been a part of the discussion of climate policy tool for years. In fact, in some ways, we could have been organizing this type of session 11 years ago when I joined the IEA, but we're 11 years on and we're wiser. And I think one of the important points that Wendy stressed in particular and picked up in your presentation, Harry, is that when we look in particular emerging economies, what we see are power sectors that are not marked by the type of liberalized structure we see in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere in most OECD countries, but rather power sectors that are often dominated by specifically state-owned enterprises. For example, China, Indonesia, India, Mexico, the list goes on and on. And so while on the one hand, we all, I think, can appreciate the efficiency and other potential gains from carbon pricing, and in particular ETS systems and the like, one of the questions I think it'll be important for us to touch upon in this session is that the right tool when we're looking at a system that is dominated by state-owned enterprises? In that regard, at Columbia, we recently published a couple of studies that look at this particular issue in specifically. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, what we found is, yes, electricity is the largest emitting sector among all the sectors, and about half of the emissions of the electricity sector come from specifically state-owned enterprises. And one of the questions is, to what extent is carbon pricing the right or most effective tool to incentivize state-owned enterprises? We have a wonderful panel, which I will introduce speaker by speaker, that cover, importantly, some of the variety of sectoral structures that we see, in particular in developing countries, but also in advanced economies. And so without further ado, let me turn to our first panelist, Mandy Rambaros from ESCOM. Mandy is the general manager of the Just Energy Transition for ESCOM's holdings. And I think equally important for the purposes of this presentation, Mandy represents ESCOM on the World Bank's Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition Advisory Committee. And obviously, that also means that Mandy works for one of the most prominent state-owned enterprises in the world, ESCOM. So over to you, Mandy, to sort of help us understand maybe under what circumstances carbon pricing works, but also touching upon some of the other issues of some of the impacts in terms of the just transition and other aspects. Mandy?
Thank you so much, Philip, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. And it's great to see so many participants. And I think, we had a really great foundational setting now by the previous speakers. Harry spoke to a number of the instruments and Wendy picked on a number of the issues that we're actually dealing with currently. So as you mentioned, we're the biggest utility on the African continent, about 54 gigawatts of installed capacity, and about 88% of that is coal. And so, as you can imagine, we're under a lot of pressure to transition and move away from coal for various reasons. But when it comes to carbon pricing, I think there's a number of elements that we have to look at from a developing country perspective. And like I say, Wendy touched on some of those, but I can tell you from our experience, what we have been doing is we have a strategy where we're looking to net zero by 2050 and shutting down 22 gigawatts of capacity by 2035. So shutting down 22 gigawatts of coal capacity by 2035. And so the question is, what is the best way to do that, given the fact that we're a developing country, we have capacity constraints, we do rotational load shedding right now because we do not have enough supply. And is the carbon instrument, and to get to your question, is carbon instrument the right, carbon pricing the right instrument? Just in terms of context, South Africa's energy market is dominated by two dominant players. So it's ESCOM, which is the electricity utility, and then Sasol, which is our petrochemicals liquid fuels company. So if you had to do something like a ETS, it really wouldn't work if you included all of these players. So what we would have to look at is what we would call a mix of instruments. So for big players, big emitters, what might be useful is what was on the upper left quadrant of Harry's chart there on the instruments, which is a tax. A carbon tax might work. And in fact, that is something that South Africa is looking at, the stick approach in terms of the carbon tax for the biggest emitters. But I do think that in some cases, the cement industry, manufacturing, steel industry, you could have an ETS. But what you would have to accept in your market is a mix of instruments. I don't think in certain developing country markets, certainly in our market, there's no one single answer. So you would have to look at a mix of measures. But however, what we find from an ESCOM perspective and from our perspective is to capitalize on the difference in carbon pricing between the different regions of the world. So if you look at carbon abatement in South Africa, it is much cheaper than carbon abatement in most, or if not all, developed countries, and one of the cheapest amongst developing countries. So if you look at that price differential, what we are working on is offering to the market to say it is actually cheaper to meet your compliance targets by investing in decarbonization projects in South Africa than you would in your own country. And we know carbon is a global pollutant, so you can reduce those emissions anywhere in the world and have the benefit. So that is what we have, the value proposition we've been looking at in shutting down this 22 gigawatts and what we placed on the table at COP26 that led to the $8.5 billion deal. So it's not pure carbon markets like we understand the carbon markets under Article 6, under the CDM and all of those instruments, but it's actually looking at capitalizing on the price differential of the carbon price between reducing emissions in a developed country context versus a developing country context. So I think for us, that would work. What we would have to accept is there are trade-offs. You won't be able to meet all of your goals at the same time. So you would have to look at how do you phase in decarbonization based on the different price of carbon in the different jurisdictions and over time. So Philip, there's no single answer to the question. I think we have to look at a mix of instruments, and you have to look at how do you phase in the different instruments as well. And I must apologize to the audience and my fellow panelists. I do have to drop off for another face-to-face meeting that we have. So my apologies, but those just want to leave those few remarks with you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mandy, and thanks for spending the time. Obviously, Eskom's perspective in this area is so important. And as you touched upon the critical issue, how can you effectively shut down a lot of your existing coal without sacrificing your poverty alleviation and development objectives? And in that regard, as you emphasize, financial flows, international financial flows are clearly a critical aspect of that. I'd like to now turn to, in some ways, a very different type of context, which is Chile. We are pleased to have with us Juan Pedro Ciro, who's the head of climate at the Ministry of Energy. And rather than me taking the time, let me give you more time, Juan Pedro, to sort of describe the situation in Chile and how the carbon pricing context works for you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Philip and the organizer for inviting me. No ahora, please. I'm sorry. There's a lot of people in my house. So yeah, so listening to what Harry and others have said today, well, we have a carbon tax. Well, Chile has a highly liberalized electricity market, so it's very different to South Africa. So we have a carbon tax since 2017. And let me tell you that the instrument is not working as, Harry described the carbon pricing should do. For instance, it doesn't change any investment decision. It also doesn't change the dispatch order. But what's good for the electricity sector is, and also for consumers, it's not affecting the energy tariffs. So, and I think one of the aim of putting a very low carbon price, which is just $5 per ton of CO2, was precisely not to affect the energy tariff, but there's also like a very unique formula of how the carbon tax is being implemented. So I would say like 100% of the aim was not affect the electricity prices. So what I would say in my personal view and what the Ministry of Energy is behind is trying to see if there's any chance of introducing a different instrument. I mean, how to introduce a more flexible instrument that could be more cost effective. And I don't know if you know that this new administration, this new government is behind at least the tax reform will be subject for revision. And you know that the so-called green taxes are part of this huge tax reform. The reason is not to open the discussion on how to improve the green taxes, but it will be certainly an opportunity to look at how the tax is being performing. And I'm pretty sure that one of the aims would be to increase the carbon price. If you look at the government program, there's the aim of increasing the tax. It doesn't say when, but it says at least a minimum of $40 per ton of CO2. So I cannot imagine now the tax having, being $40 today, it will be a complete mess. So we need to understand better how to reach those levels of carbon pricing. Maybe the answer is not the tax. Maybe the answer is another instrument, or the tax, but I don't know, properly implemented. And as someone said before, how to, and also Harry said it in his presentation, how to take care of, or do it in the most fair, taking care of just transition, taking care of how we could minimize the distributional impacts. I'm pretty convinced that maybe the tax is not the answer and we should look for a different instrument. So that's more or less the situation. So the tax will be reviewed again, and we will, of course, introduce changes. As you know, the tax, we introduced some reforms to the tax in 2018. So the tax now has an offsetting system. But if you look at the price of the tax, I personally don't see that the offsetting system will have any impact if the tax remains so low. If the tax increases, probably the offsetting system will become an interesting tool. So that's all on my side, and I'm really sorry because I have to jump to another I4C I double booked. It wasn't unintended. So if there's any quick question, I'm happy to answer. Then I have to leave at, I guess, at 11:45, more or less. So happy to answer any questions.
No, I think that's great. We really appreciate you spending the time. And I think you said something in passing that's important, I think, for the audience to remember. You just had an election in Chile, and you have a new, different type of government that has come into place. So it's very interesting to sort of hear your reference both to the potential desire of the government to push the green agenda, but also very sensitive to issues about the just transition and the impact on disfavored populations, something that Mandy talked about. So as much as there are differences between Chile and South Africa, there are also some important similarities.
And one just last comment, and I think that what is interesting is that there's continuity. I mean, we have a tax, the tax will be increased for sure. I don't know when, but we also have this climate change law in place. It has been recently approved, and it is very interesting because it will provide a lot of instruments for the country to reach carbon neutrality, and also for the private sector to have a more, I would say, stronger role in this journey to 2050 or even before that. So, and I'll pose a question for you, and maybe for someone to answer after I leave, is that I really have a question in my mind. Look, in Chile, the coal phase out is happening. Okay, it's happening not because of the tax; it's happening because of other reasons, and that would be the main measure to decarbonize the electricity sector first, and then all other end user sectors. So my question would be, is there any role of carbon pricing still in the journey, or we can, I don't know, push a little bit further the agenda and phase out our coal even before planned? I don't know. It's a question for you, maybe for Stefano, Luca, I don't know, Tom.
We'll come back to that. And obviously, a related point is the
Juan Pedro, very happy to respond to your question. Unfortunately, you will not be there, but next time I meet you, given our
No, but I have until 11:45. I have to jump to another meeting.
Well, let me use this opportunity maybe to transition things. Daniele will respond to you separately, and obviously we all know that in the Chilean situation, who owns the coal is different than who owns it in the South African situation. But one of the purposes of this panel was also to discuss how we can make carbon pricing work to meet our climate goals. At some point, I'm giving you a heads up, Tom, we're going to come back and I'm going to circle back to you in the Q&A session for you to describe how carbon pricing can help, because a lot of what the presenters have all talked about are really raising reservations about either the effectiveness of carbon pricing or unintended impacts. Daniele, turning it over to you, the head of energy and climate policies from Enel. Daniele works on climate policies in over 30 countries in which Enel is active, and looking to you, Daniele, maybe to give us a sense as to how carbon pricing can work, and what are some of the lessons that we can draw from experience in terms of the conditions that help to make it work. Daniele?
Yeah, no, thank you, Philippe, and thank you to the organizer for this wonderful panel. Too short of time, of course, but we'll try to make the best out of it. Yes, we operate in more than 30 countries, including South Africa and Chile. So I was relating very much to the experience of the previous two panelists. Just for those of you who don't know us, we have a net zero commitment by 2040 at the global level, which implies phasing out coal, also in Chile, by 2027, and tripling our 50 gigawatts of renewables to 150 by 2030. And today, renewables are 50% of our installed capacity. To support this, we're actually putting money on the table. There's 170 billion euros in our investment plan for the next 10 years, and almost half of it is on renewables. So we're really pursuing and looking at the countries in which you already have assets, more than 30, but also the ones in which we don't have assets, to try to understand, what is the context which is more conducive to our deployments. Of course, carbon pricing is a big part of our picture. We have been strong supporters of carbon pricing historically at all levels. Our CEO is always very active, and he just spoke in Davos at the World Economic Forum today within the CEO Climate Leaders Alliance, and we're members of the CPLC. We like carbon pricing because, of course, it gives flexibility, it brings that efficiency, but also because generally it's very credible. When you put a carbon price, it normally stays. It can vary, but it's there to stay. And cap and trade is actually the one we like the most because it sets a cap. It really gives you an idea of how serious a country is. So in that sense, as we span the world to try to figure out where to invest, carbon pricing is always on my desk and people are asking me for my outlooks. Now, however, I share some of the perplexities of the previous speakers. I mean, it is spreading, but it is too slow. Too slow in the price rising. The frameworks are there, which is a good, it's good news. Too slow in terms of ambition. And again, the first thing, however, is that there is a cap in a lot of these carbon pricing countries, and that for us is already a first show of commitment. Unfortunately, to actually deploy our renewables today, we normally use other instruments that policymakers make available. So in that sense, policy interaction is something very important that we look at as we look at countries like Chile, like South Africa, that are implementing carbon pricing schemes. Now, going to try to understand, see what are the strategic things that governments can do in order to make carbon pricing more effective. From our point of view, the first one, again, is the long-term view. A clear trajectory for the cap will tell investors how ambitious you are in decarbonizing and how reliable you are in actually creating the conditions for us to deploy our assets like renewables, which means infrastructure, means permitting processes, all those things that regulation on market regulation. So that's the first strategic issue that governments really need to look at. The second very important one, and it's been exploding in the last couple of years, is a social dimension. More and more, we've got the economics, or the environmental part dimension of cap and trade was there. The economics have emerged. The social dimension is still underestimated. We need to pay more attention to what is going on, and it is very active in this area, both with its own workforce, with the workforce of the supply chain, and the impact on our customers, but also on industry on a wider sense. So social dimension, second strategic direction. Third strategic is the interplay with other policies. Too often, who does cap and trade tends to just think in silos. I'm doing my cap and trade system, and that's all I see. And same thing with carbon taxes. More and more in ENEL, we've realized in the last 10 years that the interaction, especially with market design, is key. And Philippe, you were mentioning market structure. Of course, it varies across the world. And in that sense, too often people neglect how the market structure, the type of regulation of the power markets in the country do need to be considered very carefully as you set up your carbon pricing scheme. So that's the third strategic dimension. Going more on a nitty-gritty part of what improvements can be done to the framework as a country prepares for carbon pricing, even here, the perfect number, of course, is always 3. The first one is data collection. I mean, we've seen it everywhere. If you don't have good data on which to base your allocation, you really run the risk of having a big flop and having a big bust. So in that sense, getting companies accustomed to how to collect data, make it reliable, the quality of the data collection is important. The second part is the verification process. Verifiers of the monitoring data play a key role in improving the system and giving its credibility. A ton has to be a ton. And so even there, a country has to invest to make sure that they have credible verifiers who know what they do and who can also help companies improve their systems in a framework of continuous enhancement and improvement. The third area, which is often neglected, is the financial accounting. A company gets serious about something when it puts it on its books. And too often when cap and trade is implemented, people don't think of how a company is going to account for it and how we're going to make sure that this asset that we're transferring to companies in terms of either grandfather emissions or allocated through auctions will change their financial performance. And that's something that takes time to build that culture in the financial accounting world of a country. So we really encourage countries that do think of carbon pricing to talk with the accounting firms, the big fours that have navigated the space for a while and who can give them some advice on best approaches on making sure that the value of carbon is actually correctly reflected not only in the emissions report, but also in their financial books. So I'll leave it to that in order to leave some space for a Q&A. Thank you very much again for organizing a very interesting event.
Thank you for that, Daniele. And also just as a reminder to everybody, thank you to the leadership of Enel in this area. Clearly, as you mentioned, your chairman has been very active and your company has been very active. I think one thing that's very interesting to note in your presentation, as an operator, fundamentally you're a private sector company that's investing, let's talk outside of Italy, and what is the sort of incentives that cause you to decarbonize provides a very important perspective. The financial dimensions that you described also, I think, also very much reflect that you are an efficient private sector company. A lot of time we know that in these emerging economies, we're dealing with less efficient public sector utilities. And in some ways, if I could sort of combine some of the questions we've gotten where people have talked about the need to balance increasing emissions, managing increasing emissions from developing countries with their development needs, to what extent is maybe carbon price too much of a blunt tool? What I'd like to do to turn it to the panel more broadly, you, Daniele, Harry, and you, Tom, as well, is given this reality, given all the points that people have made, when we think about the need to reduce emissions rapidly going forward, are we spending too much time talking about carbon pricing? Daniele, it sounds, go ahead, please.
I'll just be very short. I don't think we are. I think too often we think of carbon pricing as the level of the price, and too much attention has been placed on how high it has to be. The real beauty is the cap. That sets environmental goal, that makes explicit political decision. And so I think especially when it is possible, and I realize that in some countries because of the structure of the industry is not possible, carbon pricing should be cap and trade, because the cap is clear, this political decision, measurable and accountable for. So I think we're not, and we also have to think of carbon pricing as part of a wider policy toolbox that needs to be used together. And too often we're polarized and carbon pricing needs to do all the work, whereas no, that's not the answer. It's the right combination.
Right, and I think I want to also stress a point that you made and other people made that we wouldn't have heard about so much 10 years ago, and that is the just transition dimensions and dealing with the disempowered. But if I could sort of push back on that, and I understand that's from an Enel perspective, and maybe this is a segue into maybe opening the question to Tom. One of the questions in the chat had to do with Mexico. So in Mexico, you've got fundamentally dominant vertically integrated utility CFE. You've actually had a change in government in Mexico that has an impact on the way CFE is actually managing its low carbon transition. In that kind of context, is carbon pricing really the most effective way, or is there some more direct communications between the president and the CFE that might lead to better results? So I throw that to you, Tom, in some ways, recognizing that different countries have different market structures.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, I build on what Danielle has just said, that not only is it not carbon pricing is never going to be the only tool and the silver bullet. It's always going to be the mix. The other point to flag up, because a lot of people have been saying it's a blunt tool, but in fact, when you look at the different examples of carbon pricing in different schemes around the world, it's actually one of the most flexible tools one sees. You can, the level, the scope, the benchmarking, there's all sorts of levers and pulleys involved in a carbon pricing scheme, which can be different and catering to particular circumstances. I think if one thing people take away from this workshop is that to remember that it's not just the European ETS at 80 plus euro or Scandinavian level carbon prices. It's not just a tool for the developed world. That we have real world examples of South Africa, of China, of Thailand, where it's actually working on the ground. And perhaps to take the China example, which I know a bit better than the Mexican case, but it's in a sense it's similar, the big state-owned, state-dominated and vertically integrated structures, but even there can be a role for carbon pricing, because even individual plants within a state-owned vertically integrated apparatus could be susceptible or responsive to price signals. So to my mind, that's what we've got to focus on. Examine the state of the wholesale market, the retail market, the ownership structure, the regulatory framework. If within any of these points, there's an actor who is responsive to price signals, whether it's at the plant level or the utility level or the wholesale market level, then there can be a role for carbon pricing. That's what I would say.
Right, but if I could push back, and I'm glad you raised China, because actually when I was at the IEA, we did an emissions trading simulation with China that presented challenges, and we know China's had problems actually putting in an effective ETS system that is sort of promoting the type of trading. The caps are working very well, coming back to Daniele's points, but maybe the trading isn't working as well. If I could sort of flip the question I think is less, does carbon pricing help? Can it be effective? I think the question is more, given the urgency that we face now and the need to reduce emissions, if you arrived from Mars and you were looking at the world, would you start with carbon pricing or would you start with other policies? And the reason I mention that is I think we all understand there are limited capital, intellectual, and other resources. So my question in some ways is, given where we are today, given the experience that we've had going back, does it make sense for us to continue to focus in on carbon pricing, in particular, in picking up some of the questions we're getting for developing countries that face, poverty alleviation and growth needs? So if I could throw that back quickly, both to you, Tom, and Daniele, for just 1 minute answers, and then I have to throw it over to Luca.
Quickly, I would say that depending on the local circumstances, yes, if it can be implemented, if there's the institutional framework there that does not need to be built from scratch. For instance, even if there's an effective taxation regime, if there's an effective accounting and reporting regime that Daniele mentioned, then it doesn't take 5 years to build things up from scratch and create a carbon pricing framework. And in those circumstances, yes, carbon pricing can play a role. And another important thing to mention, you flagged it in the context of the just transition, is the whole story of revenues. There's a growing need, governments need revenues, and practically every carbon pricing case you look at, it's raising millions, if not billions, in revenues across a broad tax base, and able to use those revenues in a very targeted manner, whether it's to compensate households or to compensate utilities or to finance R&D in green tech. So that the revenues is a very useful comeback when it comes to implementing a scheme that can help also address energy poverty concerns.
Well, great. Thanks a lot. And as the co-host, I think I'm going to leave the last word to the IEA. Daniele, we're running out of time. So let me throw it back over to you, Luca, and thank you to all the panelists who are still here and those who had to leave. Luca?
Thanks very much, Philippe, for facilitating the discussion, such rich discussions actually in very short, in very limited time. We learned definitely a lot from a wide variety of speakers. Now to conclude, I would like to invite my colleague Stefano De Clara from who is the head of secretariat at ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership, for some concluding remarks. Stefano, over to you.
Thank you, Luca, and thank you all. I'll try to do justice to the great discussion we just had, and try the tough job of connecting all the dots and summing up in a second what we talked about. And we did cover a lot of ground for just 50 minutes. So I think what we heard today is that carbon pricing is a cost-effective and increasingly popular mitigation option available for decarbonization. Broadly, nearly all the carbon pricing instruments currently in place, and these are, most typically emission trading systems and carbon taxes, do cover emissions from the power sector. And as we heard today, carbon pricing can be used to drive decarbonization in the power sector, but it has to be done in the right way, and there are complications in the process. There are factors such as power market structures and other local circumstances that can pose challenges to the implementation and especially to the effectiveness of carbon pricing policies, and we heard many examples of that on the panel today. As such, and being conscious of that, we need clarity on how carbon pricing would function in different circumstances and under different market structures, and whether any adjustment to the carbon pricing design or to the broader regulatory environment would be needed to make sure that carbon pricing does what it's supposed to do. Just a few bits and pieces from today's discussion. I think key things to look into are the role of carbon pricing in planning for the decarbonization of the power sector, the impacts of carbon pricing and interactions with other policies that might regulate the same sector, the response to carbon pricing across the whole supply chain, and especially in terms of who will bear the actual cost of the implemented policy, as well as understanding the distributional implications and possible solutions to a power price in to a carbon cost in the power sector. As well as the need to carefully planning for carbon pricing implementation and base that planning on reliable data and thorough assessment. As Harry mentioned at the beginning, we are planning to look into all of that through a joint study between the World Bank Group, ICAP, and the IEA that we're hoping will offer developing countries a useful starting point for considering or refining the implementation of carbon pricing policies in the power sector. To that end, today's discussion was extremely helpful in understanding the direction of travel for that study, and we are excited to be looking into it in the coming months. And we will make sure to come back as soon as we learn something out of that process, and we will make sure to get back in touch as soon as we have results out of that. Thank you again, everyone, for taking the time today. Thank you to the excellent speakers and panelists and moderators. It's been a great discussion. See you on the next I4C event. Thank you.